Dollar Dollar Bills by Charles Kienzle. Your life flashes before your eyes when you're plunged into a threatening circumstance, such as the nose of the private jet you've boarded for a weekend of bliss decides to point straight down at the quickly approaching ground beneath. The captain's voice comes not over a speaker as in commercial flights, sounding cool, calm, and collected. "Attention passengers, we are experiencing technical difficulties." No. In a private jet featuring only 6 chairs, a sofa, and a bar, the captain's cabin is much closer, and in such situations as these, the door swings open rapidly as you hear the captain yell from within, "Everyone brace yourselves, we're fucking going down!" This single sentence is enough to wide-eye anyone on the jet, as the plane violently jolts forward, causing your stomach to turn and your hands to flail blindly for your seatbelt. Adrenaline-fueled panic sets in as you hear the thin relief of the seatbelt click into place. You tuck your head to your knees and close your eyes, praying to a god you hardly know or crying in protest, echoing a single thought racing through your panicked mind. Why me? It doesn't really matter how you plan to spend those final few seconds, as your mind has plans of its own and soon flow the flashbacks. At first, it came as sudden flashbacks quickly interrupted by the random screams and crashes around him. The plane jolted a second time, and the owner of this jet, millionaire divorcee Gertrude Bentelman, screamed loudly as Richie watched her nearly fly out of her seat, her hands digging into the armrests, using all of her might to keep herself in her chair. "You have to buckle your seatbelt," yelled from the seat facing Richie on his side of the aircraft. Richie turned his head toward the stewardess sitting across from him. "Miss Gertrude, you have to buckle your seatbelt," she yelled again, leaning forward in her seat, pointing toward Gertrude's waist. Richie closed his eyes, and he was in high school making out with Sandra Myers in the locker room. She was the most popular cheerleader of his school, and when Richie locked lips with that sexy senior, he not only lost his virginity as a freshman a few days later, but also solidified his reputation for the following 4 years of his high school career. Richie opened his eyes as he heard the stewardess get out of her seat in front of him. He raised his head and watched as she sway-stepped toward the panicking millionaire. "Don't get out of your seat," Richie thought as the plane jolted again, lunging her into his lap. Richie flinched back in his seat, turning his head away from the stewardess as she landed sideways on him. Those same supple curves lost their original temptation now that the plane was in a nosedive. He remembered seeing her as he boarded this plane, with thoughts running through his mind such as, "Does she come with the weekend package?" Or even more crude thoughts as he traced up her firm thighs to her navy blue tight skirt. "She can check my baggage in any compartment she would like." Richie helped her up, and she continued toward Gertrude, who was screaming hysterically. The two of them struggled for a few seconds when the captain yelled his final word, "Fuck!" elongated through a small door just once before the ear-wrenching sound of metal scraping and ripping, followed by everything going black. Richard Nars, better known as the man, the myth, or the legend, albeit sarcastically and usually behind his too tight dress shirt covered back, made a name for himself at Galleon Sons, a sleazy law firm specializing in automotive claims. You know the sort, you see the commercials all the time. In an accident, call, insert crafty 2-part name here, and we'll make sure your slightly sore neck becomes a lifetime of dollar bills. Dollar dollar bills, y'all. Needless to say, many fortunate fender fibbers called, and good old Richie delivered, making his clients and himself very wealthy, very fast. Most courtrooms ate up his charm, and the lonely defendants with court-appointed lawyers would buckle. He would gleam his pearly whites, which looked almost too white against his year-round permanent tan, run his fingers through his jet-black combed-back hair, or use his patented look, self-named the jury killer, in which he would curl his eyebrows upwards from the bridge of his nose in an expression of pity or sorrow, and the jury would fold. Soon followed the courtroom javelin and wham bam thank you ma'am, dollar dollar bills, y'all. His charisma carried him far in life. A man with a silver tongue such as his almost never faced failure. He wooed the masses, as it were, and to all that knew him, he seemed to be above it all. Countless nights were spent with various women, some of which were clients whose wealth surpassed his own after they had met. Some jury members who not only fell for his courtroom charm, but also into his bed after a quick chat and a few drinks. Yet none of them mattered more to him than the occasional roll in the hay with a few lovely judges he had bedded over the years. He drove fast cars, dated fast women, and made fast money. Living the high life, he paid no attention to anyone or anything that didn't serve him in some way. So when his latest made millionaire divorcee invited him for a weekend of catered bliss, you know damn well he didn't hesitate to pack his bags and go. Richard, aka Richie to his friends and Dick to those who opposed him, was getting measured for a new suit when his phone rang. The snooty tailor stood up from Richie's inseam and pulled on the ends of his tight, colorful vest as he flicked his nose to the air. Richie leaned over, grabbing his phone after a brief chuckle at the expense of the tailor. "Hey, good looking," Richie said. A large smile grew across his face as he answered his phone. "How's life treating you?" "Richie, darling," came through the other end, muffled by Richie's cheek. Richie stared out the tall window to his left as the woman on the other end of the phone began her pitch. Various people passed as he half listened and watched the mundane daily routines of the unknowing people on the other side of the glass. Richie found them fascinating in ways most people would find jarring. A mother pushing a stroller with her baby became a potential hit and run, racking up an easy 6 figures, 7 if something happened to that poor, innocent baby. A construction worker hanging by a line from the crane became a manufacturer's nightmare in a widow's new house. His favorite, of course, was the teenager behind a speeding sedan. So many juicy options if that goes south. Come on, kid. Just look at that text message, just for a quick sec. Nothing'll happen, Richie thought as his attention was brought back to the conversation. So what do you say? Want to come celebrate with me? Richie paused for a moment, imagining the cool breeze of the ocean on his sun-bathed face, the low sound the ice made in his tall drink as he pulled it up to his lips, the view of many barely there bikini-toting toddies. Richie pulled himself back to the tiny, overpriced tailor shop and waved the tailor back in to finish the job. How can I say no, sweetness? Excitement sprung from the other side of the line. Richie pulled the receiver away from his ear, making eye contact with the tailor, who looked up unamused by the sudden scream before letting out a small snort and returning to his measurements. I'm excited too. Yeah. Okay. Meet you there at 9. Sounds good, doll. Okay, bye-bye. As Richie hung up the phone, he second-guessed this decision only briefly, yet the image of room service and half-naked women helped him shake off his concern. Pain exploded into life as Richie opened his eyes. At first, he only managed a few struggled blinks, with each his head surging with pain like the waves of the beach he was looking forward to. Richie opened his eyes as a sizzle came from some wiring above his head. It sparked just as his eyes were able to focus on it, causing him to flinch. The smell of smoke filled his nostrils, causing him to cough. With each cough, his chest and back flared up in protest. After a relentless coughing fit, he tried to look around from his pinned position in the chair, the seatbelt digging into his side, holding the weight of his body to the chair, now at an angle. Random sparks and fires filled the darkened interior of the mangled plane. Richie reached for the belt at his waist, tugging and fidgeting with the buckle for some time before it released, flopping him out of the chair onto his side with a hard thud. His eyes were closed tight as the pain surged again, this time from his right side and leg. The plane moaned and creaked around him, echoing his own moans of pain. Richie grit his teeth as he pushed himself up onto his butt, sitting against the armrest of the chair that seemingly saved his miserable excuse for a life. Richie laid his head back against the side of the chair, closing his eyes in an attempt to deal with the excruciating pain covering his entire body. His left shoulder and arm throbbed, momentarily misleading him down a fearful thought of possibly having a heart attack. He reached over, grabbing his left arm at the elbow with his right as the pain intensified. His right leg burned from the knee up to his thigh. He looked down at the blood-covered torn pants, not wanting to pull back the flap of torn cloth covering his knee, screaming at him in pain. He slowly released his left arm and used his shaky right hand to pinch the end of the cloth. As he pulled it away to reveal his leg, it tugged wetly on the mangled mess beneath. The skin once covering his knee was completely gone, leaving a giant patch of red-colored flesh in its absence. The bone and tendons of his leg were exposed, and as Richie first looked down at the tenderized flesh, all his pain disappeared briefly. Richie's eyes widened as his leg began to bleed profusely, and he pressed the torn fabric back down onto his flesh. My damn leg is screwed. I'm gonna bleed out in this metal tomb, he thought while looking around him for something to use to stop the bleeding. A sudden flash hit his chaotic mind of a movie he watched where someone used a belt to tourniquet a leg wound. Richie reached up to his leather belt, unbuckling it and struggling to pull it off from around his waist. He wrapped it around his thigh, about midway up, and looped the loose end through the buckle. He pulled it as tight as he could and tied it off. The pain returned rapidly as Richie felt all his energy drained from his body. His head laid back against the chair as the interior of the plane began to spin around him. His eyes grew increasingly heavy and his breathing shallowed. He faded with one final thought wafting through his mind. I'm gonna die here. Richie woke up sometime later to the low sound of rain drumming on his metal resting place. His legs still throbbed, but much less now that he cut off most of the blood flow to his wound. He struggled up to his feet, pushing off the lean chair against his back, his right arm doing most of the work as his left was stiff and the pain from his shoulder made it impossible to move. He curled it across his chest, grabbing the collar of his shirt tight with his left hand to hold his arm's weight. As he stood, his right foot felt the familiar tingle of 1,000 needles piercing as he placed it lightly down under him. The interior of the plane was almost pitch black, with the small fires giving off a dim light before had burned their course. A giant hole on the side of the plane was a few feet ahead of him, but the darkness of the night outside almost added no light. Richie tried to make his way toward the hole, dragging his dead leg awkwardly behind him. His third blind step in the darkness caught on something on the floor, sending him over onto his face. He caught himself slightly with his right hand, but still cracked his head hard on the side of a drink cart toppled over. Richie pushed himself up, swinging his legs around to a sitting position when he heard it for the first time. Low, yet clear, he heard the small laugh of a child just outside the giant hole of the plane. Blood ran down his forehead into his right eye, blinding him. Richie wiped his eye rapidly, near frantic, as the sound he had just heard came again as his eyes closed with the pressure of his hand violently rubbing. Richie whipped his head toward the hole and saw two small bony hands grabbing the side of the plane's torn opening. "What the fuck?" Richie yelled, kicking his good leg against the floor, pushing himself away from the hole. His back pressed against something soft behind him. Just as he stopped kicking his legs, something dangled across his chest. He reached up with his right hand and pulled it away to look at it. Purple polished fingernails were attached to the arm he now held. "Ah!" Richie screamed, throwing the arm over his head, pushing off his back away from it. He flailed forward, looking back after a brief crawl away. Pinned to the bent, destroyed metal of the plane was the remaining part of the red-headed stewardess. Her eyes were glossed over, her mouth stretched open into a final terror-fueled yell. Her tongue dangled limply out of her cherry-red lips. Hair pasted across her face in various spots where blood had run down, dripping into a pool beneath her. Her arms swung loosely like a swing in the wind from her suspended torso. Richie looked to his right and saw the blood-covered tight skirt and legs sprawled across the floor. Her waist torn in half, her intestines spread across the floor of the plane. It dawned on Richie as he looked over that it was her legs he had tripped over, smashing his head a few moments before. "Come play with me, Richie. Come play," he heard in the same small child's voice. He turned and saw a small silhouette standing in the opening of the plane. "Ah!" Richie screamed, backing away from the opening, again toward the split-in-two stewardess. "Don't be afraid, Mr. Nars. She's only a child," came from behind him in a low, soft voice. Richie turned away from the voice and watched in terror as the pinned stewardess's eyes slowly rolled in their sockets. They heavily struggled into place, making eye contact with him. Her jaw clicked and cracked into place as her tongue slipped back into the dark reaches of her mouth. She smiled. "What the fuck is this?" Richie yelled, pushing away from them both, deeper into the plane until his hand landed on something wet and stringy. Richie pulled his hand to his face, seeing it covered in dark red blood. He leaned forward and looked behind him. In a rippled pool of dark red, blonde hairs floated leading up to a face-down head. Richie gulped, turning away from the head and closing his eyes tight. "It's all in my head. It's not real. It's..." Ahead of him in the farthest part of the plane he heard shuffling and groaning. Richie squinted, one eye open, and looked ahead into the darkness. Vaguely he saw movement, but his eyes couldn't make out what it was. "Stop! Stop, you hear me? Don't come any closer!" Richie yelled, balling up his one good fist to his side. Lightning flashed outside, giving the interior a brief flash of bright light. The child stood right in front of Richie. It was a young girl wearing a polka-dot flowered dress. Lined around its otherwise pure white cloth was a pitch-black ribbon. Around the neck of the dress, each arm, and the bottom hanging just below the knees. She wore long white socks that shot up her thin legs under her dress from a pair of shiny black penny loafers. Richie caught a quick glimpse of her from the flash of light. Her hair was tied up into a small ponytail with a bright pink bow. She was smiling. Richie closed his eyes, raising his fisted right hand above his head as he lowered his head to his chest. "Get away from me!" his voice quivering beneath the yell. "Silly Richie, I just want to play. Not like you have much else to do." "What is this? Am I having a nightmare? Am I going crazy?" Richie whined as he heard the little girl's voice just past his tucked head. "You're dead," she whispered. Richie looked up past his arm shielding his head as the little girl's smile widened and stood back up. I'm dead? No, this can't be. So much pain. I had my fucking seatbelt on. I can't be dead." The little girl laughed, placing both of her bony hands on each hip. "Silly Richie, look." Richie dropped his arm to his side as he watched the child point at a turned-down body laying face first by the drink cart. "You were pretty weak. Tripped, cracked your head open, and that was that. Done deal. Or as your life motto goes, dollar bills, y'all." The girl turned back to the lack-jawed Richie and giggled. "So come on, silly. We don't have much time." Richie looked up at her. "Time for what?" "To play, silly. We don't have much time before you're called." The girl reached out, open palm towards Richie. Richie stared at her hand for a moment before he clasped his in hers. called?" he asked as he pulled himself to his feet, instantly noticing the pain that had crippled him before was gone. The two of them began walking through the plane toward the opening on the side. "Yes, called," she huffed. "Who's gonna call?" The little girl laughed. "Okay, Mr. Ghostbuster." She continued to walk, as Richie pulled her hand back toward him and leaned over head level to her. "Who is gonna call me?" The little girl rolled her eyes and turned away, leading him past his face-down corpse. "You know, come on, think about it." She stepped over his body, slowly raising one leg over at a time in great strides. They reached the opening of the plane. Richie looked out, staring at the forest surrounding them. The dirt was torn up underneath the plane in large skids across the ground. Trees and pine needles sprayed out in all directions from the plane's crash. Random chunks of metal and cloth lay scattered across the ground outside. "God? Is that who's gonna call me?" Richie looked down at the little girl on his right side as she giggled. "Do you see a heavenly light somewhere?" Richie looked back out at the dark forest through the opening. The little girl stepped behind Richie as she said, "Let's just say you didn't make that team." She cackled and shoved Richie from behind. "That's okay, though. I'll take ya," she screamed as she jumped onto his back, and the two of them fell through the opening. As Richie quickly approached the ground below, it opened up into a deep, large chasm. Arms and bony hands protruded from the dirt in various spots, reaching and clawing towards them. Richie screamed as the little girl laughed, digging her clawed hands deep into his sides. They continued to fall straight down as an orange glow started to come into view below them. Rusty chains shot out across from one side of the chasm to the other, penetrating the dirt and arm walls with great force. The walls began to retract closer to them as they continued their plummet. The little girl cackled loudly as they reached a depth past the walls, falling toward a solid ground floating in a fiery lake below. Richie slammed down with a thud face first into the platform and quickly turned, looking for the little girl. Amongst the large fire wall surrounding the pillar, he saw her silhouette in the distance. She walked closer to him, and the stretched and skewed details of her became visible. Her once cute and innocent appearance faded, her hands stretched out into large claws as she raised them out to her sides, her legs elongated with each step into bones, her feet like hoofs. She had large horns protruding from her forehead, and as they grew and curled, her hair turned into fire. She stepped closer to Richie as he screamed, and the opening above him slammed shut. She smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth gnashing together. She whipped her long, snake-like tongue out of her mouth, licking the side of Richie's cheek. As it slithered back into her mouth, she reached for him. "Now we can play forever."